I'll just pray just before I start. So, Lord, I thank you for gathering us here. We thank you that you instruct us to take a day of rest, and you instruct us to study your word, to fellowship, to share in the scriptures and our understanding of it, to share in the bread and wine, and you give us many instructions, and they're all God-given, wise, holy instructions for making us into the kind of people that we should be had sin not come upon Adam. And I pray, Lord, as I just share these things, that your word would speak to each of our hearts, including mine, and may all that I say be of you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I've been pondering on something for about a year in my work, and some of the things I've been doing are quite kind of repetitive, so it gives you the chance to for your mind to sort of ponder on things. And I'm going to show you a few things in a minute that have done this. And I felt, as I said, I've been thinking about it for a year, and I felt, beginning of this week, I must work on this and put it down. I felt a sense of urgency, which, after a year is quite a long time. So it came upon me, and I felt that I just dropped Pete Cowling an email, a text yesterday, just saying, I've got to talk, and if it seems to fit, it would be okay to speak. And rightly in this church, we try to make sure that whoever speaks. And I was sat at the back, wondering, well, I wonder what will happen. So it's very interesting, the way in which the service has gone so far. And I felt that it sort of crescendoed and kind of built up to this whole point of seeing God as and respecting him and worshipping and having an awe about him. And Gordon, it was interesting that more than interesting, your prayer, because it kind of brought things really to the point where I'd like to sort of pick up, which is, it's on the kind of theme of creation or creating things. And I hope you find this helpful. I'm basically going to look at a theme. So I'm not looking at one passage. I've got a lot of passages. We'll just look at each one briefly, because I want to sort of show the thread, if you like, of something. And I'm just putting them up on the screen, only so that you can mostly just look at the screen if you like. You're not thumbing through your Bible left, right, and centre. But I don't want that to be a distraction. A verse that really got me thinking about this theme, I've called it the Master Pattern Maker, and I'm going to elaborate on that. But a verse that got me thinking about this was Hebrews 1:3, which tells us that Jesus, who being the brightness of his, that's the Father, being the brightness of the Father's glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And it was this phrase, express image. Now, I'm just going to briefly just say a little bit about making things as a human, because I've kind of been involved in quite a lot of things, work-wise, and that's what's kind of informed my thinking. And I'm only showing these just to sort of help the illustration. So one of the things I'm wanting to do as I speak is talk about how men make things, and then how God makes things. And they're kind of similar, but not the same, because God's in a higher order. We're the created. He's the creator. And if you want to understand and be in a right place before God, the first thing that I'm categoric about is you must understand He's the creator, we're the created. And I say that because the Bible makes it abundantly clear, and just looking around you, if your eyes are open, it's quite abundantly obvious that when you start thinking that you're the God and that you make God in your image, it all goes horribly wrong. That's because it is wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. The first verse of the Bible is, in the beginning, God created. That's the starting point of everything, okay? And interestingly, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, I believe that the reason why a university is called a university, because it's universe, verse 1, uni 1. That's because back in the day, before woke thinking and all sorts of other things came along, men understood that if we want to understand the world in which we live, we need to understand how God has created it. Okay, and it's all got corrupted and all sorts of other weird and unhelpful things go on in a university today. But that's the thing. He created everything, and so we need to understand how he creates and how we kind of work with his creation. And there is a kind of a part 2 to this talk that I haven't yet written, but it's kind of in my head, which is how does this whole thing of pattern making work with us as Christians? Okay, because it's there quite explicitly in the Bible. So I just kind of tell you where I'm eventually heading with all this. But I think it's really important to kind of just lay the foundations and understand how are things supposed to be, how were things, how did God build up to where we are now. So just quickly, and I'm just going to briefly mention, if you could just put the next slide up, just a list of kind of ways in which humans make things. So one of them is, and all of them, if you like, are kind of what you might call a pattern. We tend to think of a pattern as being, like sort of on a piece of wallpaper or a piece of fabric or something. So it's a repeated, something that kind of repeats itself, but which is indeed correct. That is a pattern. But a pattern is also something that enables the pattern to be created. So, for example, in a fabric making factory, it's the loom and the weft and the waft and all the kit that's there. And to be honest, the person that's really clever is the guy that invented and made the kit that makes the fabric, not the fabric. Okay, the people who make the fabric largely just rock up and just feed the thread into the bobbins and all that kind of stuff and press the button and off it goes. And so it is with everything else. In fact, if in manufacturing, people who make jigs, patterns, dyes, they generally command a good wage. It's because they have to be clever people because they're going to enable you to make something that repeats itself, okay, to a design. So this is something that I had made for me, and sorry to mention the sizzle pan, but this is, I had this, which is one side of a tool, and this was just a prototyping tool. It was just to work out whether or not, if we put a piece of steel, stainless steel, and this is the other half, okay, so one's, if you like, an impression and one's an expression, which is why I got thinking about this thing of Jesus Christ being the express image, an impression and expression. Now, this is the pan, if anybody hasn't seen them. So if you like, that's one side, and that's the other side. Okay, so it's a flat piece of steel. And this is the tool, and it comes down ka-chunk with 50 tons. And because this isn't actually the tool, this was just to experiment and see whether the metal could cope with the stresses and stretching that's involved. And that's what you end up with. And we can make thousands of these. So that was one tool. And so I just mention it because that's a tool that man uses to make something repetitively. And another tool, this is one that I've made. So I've spent quite a lot of time on this. So I want to take a piece of oak and make it into that. And I want to make lots of them to the same curvature. And it's strong oak. It's not flimsy. And it's not easy, okay? And I've made about 4 sets of jigs or patterns. And this is the one that I'm working on at the moment. Now, the reason I'm showing this to you is because it doesn't look anything like the item that I'm trying to make, although you can sort of see that there's some kind of resemblance to it. So those are 2 types of pattern. I'm just emphasizing the fact that the pattern is the means to create the thing, and that's going to become relevant, hopefully, as we start looking at creation. But there are other ways in which things are made, many ways. I'll just put a few up there. And on the left-hand side, you've got a good one to start off with, really, which is freehand, from scratch. It's in your head, or it's in God's head. And there's a kind of a detail, a drawing. And it could be a drawing, it could be a description, it could be in whatever form, but it's enough instruction to follow it, and then it ends up creating. But it could be a one-off. Often is a one-off. It could be, back in the day, when I was a child, lots of mothers used to make clothing. I think it was because clothing cost more back then. You know, my mum would often have all this cloth out on the floor and cutting out and so on. So there's another type of pattern, because I don't just want to give you male examples. Okay. A shaped tool, such as an engraving tool, that's going to become relevant a bit later on, but that can be in lots of different forms. It could just be a tool that you're just moving across something or other, and if it has a V shape, and I move it across clay, rock, wood, it'll make a V shape. It'll leave the same shape as the tool. Or you could put the tool on something that spins around 1,000 revolutions per minute, and run a piece of wood around it, and it'll make a sort of an overlow sort of quadrant type bead profile on it or something. Now then there's building. There's a few builders in the audience, in the congregation, one near me. And building is another thing where you're basically taking blocks, things that exist, and then you're using those to sort of, construct or build, put one on top of another. Obvious thing being bricks and blocks, but there's many, many more things besides. Everything, plasterboard, wood, it's all being kind of fitted to one another. And out of these building blocks, you create something, a house or an extension or a church or a church building or a whatever, library. Now, the ones on the left are sort of where you're kind of making things a bit more bespoke, a bit more one-off. On the right-hand side, and because man wants to make lots of things cheaply, humans have become very adept at doing this. So one method is to cast, okay? You cast in lots of different ways. I mean, you cast when you make a cake, because the cake ends up being the shape of the cake tin. If the cake tin has a hole in the middle, the cake has a hole in the middle. But also anything that's made out of cast iron or plastic. Back in the day, in Jesus' day, nails were cast out of iron. Okay, so you have and the way you do it, you have an object, you place it in clay or sand, you take the object out and you pour, e.g. molten metal in, and it makes the same shape as the one that you took out. Okay? Now then there's sort of bending and form work, and I've just shown you that there. That's a form of it. I've showed you the press tool, where you apply a blow. Okay, a blow takes place. And when you hit a hammer, when you hit a nail with a hammer, you are actually, it's a blow to the nail, and the nail makes a nail-shaped hole in the wood. Okay? All of these will become, you'll realise why I'm telling you this later on. And then lastly, and in recent times, we've got into being quite clever, we probably like to think we are, because we've got computers and we can now draw and design things in 3 dimensions on a computer, and then take that code, and then the code becomes the pattern, and the code is used to recreate whatever it is that is going to be made. Okay, so if I could just quickly go back, sorry, just a verse, the previous slide. So, just to look at this, because this is the sort of starting point anyway for my thoughts on this. There are 2 things mentioned in this Hebrews passage. One is that Jesus is the brightness of the Father's glory, and one is that he's the express image. The brightness, as it perhaps suggests, is a kind of reflected brightness. And in the passage below, out of John 14, Jesus says to Philip, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father." So how can you say, "Show us the Father"? Jesus is the express image of the Father. And it's awesome stuff, and I'm conscious I'm trying to explain something that is too awesome for me to understand, but I'm going to have a stab at it. Express image in Greek actually is a graver, or by implication, the engraving or figure stamped. Okay, so I'm going to get into a few kind of words, and not that I was schooled in the 1970s. We didn't get taught any grammar, or some reason it was thought a good idea not to teach grammar. So I'm really no expert on these things. I just look it up, that's all. Interestingly, express image in Greek is character. So we've in English taken a word character and then we've given it a meaning. It's a very interesting meaning, actually, if you think. In fact, people who understood the Bible must have been involved in that, taking that word. Because character, correctly, is a trait. You know, what are you known by? How are you characterized? By what traits? Are you loving? Are you aggressive? Are you on time and punctual? Are you tardy and late and unreliable? Those are traits, and that's what we're characterized by, and that's what our character is. It's what's been written on us, or engraved on us. Hence, it's linked to this word graving, okay, to engrave, to inscribe. Okay. So we could just go forward 2 slides to creation of Adam, first man. So it's really handy being able to put a glass of water on here without it sliding off the Okay, Genesis 1:27. This is an obvious one that you'd imagine I would bring up. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And then a little bit later on, chapter 2, and the Lord God formed man, sort of shaped, almost as if he sort of shaped the man with his own hands, if you like. I mean, it's metaphorical. Of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostril the breath of life, and man became a living spirit. So it's from scratch, but we know that Jesus is the pattern being followed, because we're made in his image. So Jesus Christ is the original blueprint. And this is why it's such a travesty that man somehow thinks that he's God. Because, I mean, we're made in the image of God. I mean, what an awesome thing that is, and what a terrible thing it is to remove that from our thinking. It's said twice. I mean, I'm sure this is some sort of Hebrew kind of style of language. You know, you repeat the point. In his own image, he created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. It's for emphasis. It's a very important point. So it seems to me it's sort of like, and this is metaphorical, it's like God moulded man sort of seemingly out of clay. It's out of the stuff of the ground. Adam is red in Hebrew, so I presume he was sort of, in terms of his skin colour, I think he was kind of mid-coloured. And interestingly, as humans, and I'm always going to try and make a distinction between how we make things and how God, because there's an overlap but a difference. And actually, if you go into school, a good way of teaching children how to start off with art is to get making things out of clay, because clay is completely, you can sort of form it, mould it to whatever you like, and you're literally using your own fingers to shape it. And it'll hold in a three-dimensional position. You can't make everything, because sometimes you've got to get your hand inside to make it. But it's a great place to start. And interestingly, and some car manufacturers still do this. I've seen a clay mould of a Bentley, one-to-one scale, made by a chap who must be incredibly clever, who's made it. And that's because a car manufacturer wants to be able to kind of look round from every single angle and check the lines and make sure they're right. And the chap's got this giant lump of clay, and he's sort of got something like a potato peeler, and he's just sort of shaving off 0.5 millimetre each time. So great material to make things. And it later on says God formed all the other beasts out of the ground. And I hadn't actually noticed that. So they're and it's the other beasts and the flying objects. It says he formed them out of the ground. Genesis 2:19. Next slide. So just to kind of emphasise, Adam is a type of Jesus. Second half of Romans 5:14, referring to Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. And in 1 Corinthians 15:45, and so it is written, the first man, Adam, is a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. That word type there is a blow, an impression, or a form. So I was just mentioning to you that a press tool is a blow. But in fact, in this case, we know that that Adam was formed as opposed to receiving that kind of treatment. So Adam was made in the image of God. And in this business of first and last, it's a chronology, it's a time thing. It's not that Adam's the preeminent and Jesus is the secondary. It's the sequence of things, okay? Because we get to see Jesus second in time. He is the preeminent, but we see him second in time. Having made Adam, God goes on to make Eve. Next slide. Now, I found this very interesting because when you look it up, you find out that the word used to make her is different from the word used to make Adam. Adam is formed. Now, in the text, in that second paragraph, it says, then the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. But actually, when you look it up, the actual meaning is quite clear. It's built in Hebrew, which is why I spoke about building earlier on. It's interesting. So he formed man, but he already had the building block from which to make a woman, because he'd made a human, with shoulders and a head and 2 arms and 2 legs, etc. He had the building block, and so he built Eve, which is interesting because we are the bride of Christ. So we're metaphorically or in analogy times, we're going to be presented to Christ as the bride. And Jesus says to Peter, I will build my church. He doesn't say he's going to form it or anything else. He says he's going to build it. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And he's building it on this rock. And we know that the rock is Jesus Christ. It's not Peter. It's built on Christ. So just as Eve is built on Adam, the church, the bride, is built on the rock, Christ. Then we move on in the next slide to creating children. And in Genesis 1:28 it says, then God blessed them, that's Adam and Eve, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. It seems to me that God's got, we've got our coding in computers, but this coding is the means by which children are created is on a totally different level, an awe-inspiring level. It should be awe-inspiring. That God creates Adam and Eve and places within them the fruit, actually out of the fruit of their love for one another and union, that bears a child who's in the image of the man and the woman. And all the coding, and I don't pretend to understand it at all, you can just take a tiny bit of skin of me or you and the whole DNA code of me, and you can track it back to my mum and dad, and the same for you, is in there. That is just, forget computing. This is on another level. Self-replicating. And it's interesting that, thinking about in Christian terms, as we seek to share the seed that God wants us to share as Christians, there has to be fruit. The seed is inside the fruit. So you don't get any seeds if you don't have any fruit. So if we don't have love for one another, if we don't have the gifts of the Spirit, what's the other one? Not gifts. The fruit. This is the fruit. That's what I'm talking about. If we don't have the fruit of the Spirit, you don't get the seed. There's nothing to encourage somebody or other to think, what's he got in him? I'd like to have some of that. So that's interesting. The next slide, you all know this from Psalm 139. I think, interestingly, tackles this whole thing of the fact that, well, to an extent we reproduce, but we're not all, unlike a cast iron object, that you just keep making the same thing. We are the same in the sense that we're humans, and we're men and we're women, but every single one of us is different. So that's interesting, isn't it? Self-replicating, but it's same sort of form, but different personality. It says, for you formed my inward parts. So that's referring to each individual one. Now the inward parts is, in Hebrew, is kind of bowels, or which sounds a bit of an odd thing in English, but probably heart would be what we, the very inner sense of you and me, what we are. And it says it's formed. And I believe that God is telling us, I believe that God has given each of you and me an individual personality. My personality isn't a genetic cross of my mum and dad. If you've got lots of children in your family, which I have, you can tell that they got their personality from somewhere else. They didn't come from me. I mean, there's some overlap, but there's plenty of stuff that doesn't seem to come from Debbie, and it doesn't seem to come from me. And I believe that God has made every single one of you with an individual personality. He formed it. It says later on at the end there, He skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth, which, again, you look it up, it's kind of like embroidered. Embroidery takes a lot of care and skill to move different coloured threads and so on. And that's how God has made each of our personalities. And you'll know that every one of us has got a number of things, and they're very significantly placed, because the most significant parts of a human are the hands, because they're the thing that touches lots of things, and the head, and all the faculties on the head. So it's not surprising, is it, that our voice is unique. Your bank wants you to say, my voice is my password. That's because you can be told by your voice. Even though there's millions of voices, somehow it can tell. Your iris, passport office, passport control at Heathrow, they're photographing. Not entirely happy about it, but that's what they're doing. And your fingerprints. These things are quite unique to you. Okay, just so that hopefully I've sort of laid the foundations, some really important foundations of just humans and how they were created by God. And then we get on to the creation of the first temple, because the actual word pattern crops up. So Exodus 25:9, according to all that I show you, this is God speaking to Moses, that is the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings, just so you shall make it. So God gives Moses it's a written description. I don't know whether there are other things besides. And then in order to make it, we read in Exodus 31, 1-6. Let me just get the whole of it up. Then the Lord spoke, this is Exodus 31, 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, see, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship. Or it could say business, that which he is going to go about doing. To design artistic works, to work in gold, in silver, in bronze, in cutting jewels, for setting, in carving wood, and to work in all manner of workmanship. And I, indeed I, have appointed with him Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, and I have put wisdom in the hearts of all these gifted artisans, that they may make all that I have commanded you. So God had a very specific pattern that he shared with Moses, and he wanted it made just so. And it was going to be a one-off. There weren't going to be lots of these things. And they needed incredible skill to make it exactly how. And they didn't have, wood workshops like we have today and CNC routers. They had to make this stuff by hand. And God achieved it through these people because he placed the Spirit of God in them. And I pray for all of us that God would place his wisdom, place his gifting from his Spirit, that all of us could work with the effect of his Spirit, enabling us to do the things that we do, whatever it is. Then I just want to move on. It's only actually down to the end of the same chapter, Exodus 31:18. It's funny how the two are sort of in the same chapter. God has shared a lot of things with Moses, and at the end, 31:18, he says, "And when God had made an end of speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses two tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God." I mean, what it must be to receive a piece of stone that's had God's hand with his finger has actually inscribed it. As you know, the first pair got smashed, which we'll come on to in a minute. And we know that Jesus is the Word, and we have the written Word, and the Word and the written Word are powerful. They're like a double-edged sword. Written in this case is to grave or engrave. Okay. So God's finger is the tool used to carve out the letters of stone. I don't know what God's profile of his finger is, but whatever it was, that's the shape. If you cut through the stone and looked at it, you'd find something like that. And it was his finger that made it. Whatever the shape of his finger, that's the shape that was made. Just as an engraver's tools determine, they're the pattern, you get the inverse is removed. Okay. And not long after, in fact, the next verse, we move to man making idols. Probably like me, you can't believe this bit of the passage. I mean, Moses has been up there, he's receiving these words directly from God, and then the Israelites are sort of completely losing the plot, getting impatient, and they suddenly decide, well, let's make an idol. I mean, you kind of think, well, where did that come from? Let's just read it. "Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, 'Come, make us gods, that we shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him.' And Aaron said to them, 'Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me.' So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a moulded calf. And then they said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.'" You'll remember that Richard mentioned, and so did Liz, the whole thing of coming out of Egypt, "Let my people go," was mentioned earlier. He possibly made an initial mould, roughly. Maybe he carved a piece of wood, got a rough shape in gold, and then finished it off with the engraving tools. I suspect that's how he did it. I can't quite... Or he might have got it accurately. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's cast. And the thing about casting things, which I don't see, I might be wrong, I might discover, but I don't see God making casts. Okay? Because he makes originals, and he makes in the way that I've already described. But man makes casts. And one of the things he makes with casts is idols. You can make them out of stone or concrete. And I put up there, how many Buddhas do you see in the garden centre? Now, we have the men's coffee thing down at the Henry Street Garden Centre. I'm just staggered. I mean, people, and it might sound a bit flippant here, but I mean, are they saying to their wife, "Look, we need to go down to the garden centre, I need a pair of shears, we could do with some twine, oh, and why don't we get a few Buddhas to go around the house. Because you go around the garden centre or lots of shops, and it's like you ask the assistant, where are the Buddhas? And they say, oh, they're in aisle 12, 13, 14 and 15, and we've got some 8-foot ones in aisle 19. You know. Like, what are people doing buying Buddhas? What is it? Well, it's the same spirit at work, that man somehow seems to want to worship an image that he has made. That's the human nature. Instead of worshipping the God, it's obvious. If you think about it, it's obvious we're created. The more mankind knows about how to make things, and we've become as a society very proficient at making things, and the more you make things, the more you realise that good design means there's a good designer. That's a fact. You cannot have a good design without some very intelligent brains coming up with it. So therefore, if we are wonderfully made, there is a wonderful creator. Okay? And it isn't Buddha and it isn't an idol. And if you have got one of these in your garden, can I suggest you go down to the dump and get rid of it? Seriously, because it's not doing you any good whatsoever. Just continuing on this thing, and this is God, in his word, God makes the same points about idols. Just what a terrible... I mean, this was a terrible moment in Israel's history. And it's, you know, we live with the same sort of effect at work in our society today. So, making idols, Psalm 106, this is commentary on this, in the Psalms, on this same event. They made a calf in Horeb and worshipped the moulded image. And thus they changed their glory into the image of an ox that eats grass. Remember, we're made in God's image. And now these people here in this passage have made God into a cow or an ox. And so we're made, and they're saying, so we're made in that image. Like, you've lowered yourself. Like, we need to have an accurate understanding in God's word of who we are. We're made in his image. And Jesus Christ is the express image of God the Father. It's a privilege. Why throw that away? Well, only because the devil has lured you with his lies into believing utter nonsense. Just on to just a passage in the New Testament, which I think is very interesting. And on to the matter of Jesus, because, of course, Jesus... I've talked very much about the Old Testament and how things are made, but where I'm leading to is we need recreating. Because we were created in his image, but it's fallen, it's marred. And now God is in the process and has provided the pattern by which it happens, and that's what it needs to be elaborated upon, in order to be recreated. And one of the things I want to say is God does not recreate you using one of these sort of ka-chung 50-ton presses, because that would be painful. Okay, I mean, it might be quick, but it would be painful. But he doesn't work like that. That's the thing of man. And that's what we're going to discover here, actually. In John 20:25, and you probably haven't thought of this passage in this way before, but the other disciples therefore said to Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." And so Thomas said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." It's quite intriguing, this thing of Thomas's doubt. But he says he wants to put his hand into the print, or you could write imprint. I mean, I don't quite know why he wants to actually put his finger into the hole. But it's there for a reason, and I believe it's because it's just making the point that the imprints that Jesus Christ had in him, they're prints, they're the result of a blow. So man's sin has resulted in Jesus Christ having 7 blows to his body. Which I've got in the next slide, but I'll just finish off here. So the Greek word is typos. I think it's typos, from which we get the word type. And a typewriter is something that writes by putting a blow. Now, you don't know that anymore because we don't use typewriters, but back in the day, it was a metal thing that came over with the letter A, press the key, and a blow with a bit of ink on it, So actually, if you looked at the paper under a microscope, you could see it actually had an indent of the letter A. But to make it easy to read, it's got some black ink on it, or red. Those are the two choices. So it makes a blow. And you get an inverse to the thing. So the letters are express, and you get an impression into the paper. So just on to the next slide, I just listed just what I observed from the scriptures, which is you've got 6 objects that make 7 holes. I think that's right. That's because I think his legs just had the one, in the Roman crucifixion, there was one nail went through the two legs onto the post. So he's got 1, 2, a third object, but 2 holes. And he's got a crown of thorns that makes another. All of these things make an imprint into Jesus. The scourging on his back, and then he's got this sword that goes into the side. And each of these things is thrust on him. It's a blow, and it makes an imprint. And I think that, and 6 of them are of man, and 1 of them is the thorns, which are actually a result of the fall. Weeds and thorns and so on didn't exist before the fall, and I believe that they'll disappear when we go to be with Christ again. But for the time being, they're a symbol of the fall in nature. So 6 implements of man and 1 of fallen creation, and each of them makes this impression. And that's because Jesus has taken our sin. The sin has been impressed upon him. He's become sin in our place. The next slide is, and we're on the home straight now, so is Jesus in the grave. Luke 23:54, Joseph of Arimathea took the body of Jesus down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb that was hewn out of the rock where no one had ever lain before. And the word hewn is scraped out of stone. So it's like an engraving. You've scraped it out. And as such, it seems to me it's actually very similar to the law, isn't it? So the law is God's finger scraped or engraved into a tablet of stone. And where Jesus lay is a scraped out shape into which Jesus, who becomes the fulfillment of the law, lies in this rock. So there's a similarity there. And when we bury people, we put them in a grave. It's like it's been engraved. It's like a giant 6 foot deep, 3 foot wide sort of tool has come along and made a 7 foot, 8 foot long hole, and then you drop the grave into it. It's an inscription in the earth. The next passage I want to look at was this business of this coin, and it's one of these enigmatic exchanges. The more I read the Bible, the more I wonder, do I actually understand what Jesus is saying? He speaks in such a way that you have to think really hard to understand. And on this occasion, Matthew 22, let me just read it. So it's the Pharisees, as is often the case, and they're sort of trying to trick him. And they say, tell us therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Thinking that they've tricked him. But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius, a coin. And he said to them, whose image and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. I think what Jesus is explaining is there's man's domain, and coinage is quite a sort of key symbol, really, of man's domain. Man's very keen on money. Money makes the world go round, as they say. I didn't say that in the Bible. It's a non-Bible phrase. And coins, even to this day, they're trying to get rid of them, but they still, 2,000 years later, carry the image of the ruler of your nation and the inscription. Okay, so it still says, I don't know whether they've minted any coins with King Charles on it, but it used to have Elizabeth's name on it and her head, or King Charles's head. Same thing. And I think Jesus is saying, man's got his domain, and you're kind of in this world, but you need to not be of it. But you need to do certain things. But actually, my interest as Jesus is what's inscribed of God into your life. So there's man's business, but that's not really the big deal. You need to just do what you need to do. Last couple of slides. Conforming to the image of Jesus. So sort of building up to, as I say, a sort of second talk really, looking at, as Christians, how do we become how does this whole pattern making work? How do we get recreated? What role do I play in helping recreate you and vice versa? And how does Jesus work with us? This Psalm 144 by David, I think is very interesting because in his spirit he catches a kind of an understanding of where the purposes of God are going to go in the church age. I've put up there, that's actually in the King James Version. I find I do like the New King James, but I think it's a little bit, I don't really like the wording. I'll read it in the New King James, 144, verse 12. It's a desire of David here, that our sons may be as plants grown up in their youth, that our daughters may be as pillars sculptured in palace style. I don't really like that phrase, palace style. In the King James, it says that our sons may be as plants grown up in their youth, that our daughters may be as cornerstones polished after the similitude of a palace. Just sounds a lot more poetic. But when you actually look up that word polished, it means cut or carved. It's not really polished at all. Except, when you get into a really sharp blade, you do actually, in joinery terms, sort of polish it. And the similitude is a pattern, plan, or form. So, again, I mentioned this earlier on, it's similar theme to this whole thing of building the church and how the church is built up. And actually, David spoke on this last Sunday morning. You also, as living stones, are being built up. You remember I said Eve is built, the church is built, a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And we know from Psalm 118:22 that Jesus is the chief cornerstone. In here, David's desire is that the daughters may be as cornerstones, not the chief cornerstone. The chief cornerstone becomes a dating point from which everything else is then laid out, but there are other cornerstones and there are loads and loads of other stones to make a palace. And that's now what God is in the business of doing. He's making us into stones. And David, you spoke about this last time, about the fact that the rock comes from the quarry. You remember it's in 1 King somewhere. And that all the work on the rocks to sort of fashion them into the right shape takes place in the quarry, and then when they're ready, they come to make the temple, and there's not a lot of noise there's no noise in the temple, other than just quietly resting each rock that's been correctly fashioned on top of each other. Now, I don't know whether these rocks are all, absolutely straight and square and plumb, or whether they're just suitably fashioned like a dry stone wall not a dry stone wall, but a mortared wall. I don't know, it doesn't say. But the point is we're fashioned, and I believe that fashioning is what should be happening to us now, that God is working on us through, with each other, greatly assisting in that process, so that we are fit and ready to be built up, one day presented like a bride, perfect, spotless, and without wrinkle. So my last slide, just to sort of show kind of where this is going, is Philippians 3:17, and there are quite a few verses on this topic which I hadn't noticed until I started digging around, and maybe you hadn't too, but It says, brethren, join in following my example, the example being a pattern. And this is Paul writing. And note those who so walk, as you have us for a pattern. So I just want to make sure you're quite clear about the relevance, the full explanation of the relevance, sort of another time. But the point is, we are to be patterns. We should hopefully be patterns one to another. Remember what I said about the pattern. The pattern is the means by which you get formed into the right shape. It's in that sense that we're a pattern. It's not that I copy you. It's that you become a means of helping shape me. Just as these rocks in the quarry in 1 Kings that were going to be made for the Temple of Solomon were fashioned in the quarry, you and I are helping each other to fashion one another. Or we are, if we're in Christ. And last point that's really important to make is the blueprint is Jesus Christ. So you might help me, but I don't copy you. You help point me to Jesus Christ and vice versa. Because have you ever done something where you're cutting a piece of cloth or wood to, I don't know, say 20 centimetres, and you cut the first one, and you cut the second one using the first one, and the third one using the second one, and you started off at 20 centimetres, and by the end of it, it's grown to 21 and a half, okay? And the same goes with these moulds. If you make a mould of a mould of a mould of a mould, it kind of loses all its definition. So that's why we must look to Jesus Christ as he's the ultimate blueprint. And that's why and to go back to the theme that was coming out of this morning's service, that's why we worship him. That's why we look to him. We don't look to ourselves. We help one another, but each of us isn't the blueprint. Each of us is just a pattern, a means of helping to shape. He's what we need to get our gaze upon. He's the blueprint. He's the master document, the master definition of what we're trying to be. I'll end